Our first speaker this afternoon is Evan Shaw, and I will grant him the honor of introducing himself. Everyone give him a round of applause.
All right, so actually, rather than introducing myself immediately, I want to start with a story. And so at my job, we've got this large front-end application. It's mission critical. It's the most used part of the product. It's complex. It's got a lot of logic. It has to work offline. And we are making changes to it all the time. So we want to make sure that we can make these changes safely, and it felt like a natural choice to introduce TypeScript. And so about 3 years ago, I committed the first TypeScript to the repository. You may not be able to see it, but there's a tiny dot in the corner in the bottom left. And the idea was that over time, we would convert file by file, and eventually the whole code base would be TypeScript. And so some time passed, and about 2 years later, I checked in to see what sort of progress we were making. And we had migrated 40% of the code base. So not zero progress, but also not the type of progress that we'd like to see. Because at this rate, it would have taken 5 years to migrate all the way. And that is just way too long. Even 2 years is a really long time for this type of migration. But the problem was, we couldn't just stop everything we were doing to finish the migration. We really couldn't even slow down that much because there was just a lot of other stuff vying for our priorities. But luckily, one of my colleagues came across this open source project out of Airbnb called ts-migrate, and it was a tool that would automatically migrate a code base to TypeScript. So I gave it a spin, and it showed some promise, and I made a few pull requests. And then the next week, we had converted our entire code base to TypeScript. No errors, strictest settings, no bugs when we deployed it, and now we can convert a code base in an afternoon. So I'm Evan. I'm a principal engineer at Vend by Lightspeed. We are hiring with remote possibilities in New Zealand, so go have a look at our website if that interests you. And I'm also a ts-migrate contributor. And today we're going to talk about migrating to TypeScript. What are some of the challenges? What are some of the approaches you can take? Then we're going to talk about ts-migrate and how it works and how you prepare for migrating a code base. And finally, we're going to do a live demo, so everyone cross your fingers for that one. So first, migrating to TypeScript. Why TypeScript? This is not a TypeScript talk. This is a migrating to TypeScript talk, so I'll try to keep it brief. But basically, we need all the help we can get in a project, especially as it gets bigger or older or has more developers working on it. There are many tools and processes you can introduce to try to prevent mistakes. I think TypeScript is a great one, personally, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time trying to convince you in this talk. Second, I want to talk about the any type. So you may, if you're passingly familiar with TypeScript, know that you can apply types to variables and function parameters like string, number, object types. And the most general type that you can apply is the any type. It's arguably the most useless type you can apply. Like if you give a variable type any, you can basically do anything with it. And so there are no constraints, and it's not very useful. But it is quite useful as you're migrating to TypeScript because sometimes you just need to chuck an any type onto a variable and leave it for another time. And there are basically 3 approaches that I can see that you might take to migrate to TypeScript. The first being the Big Bang approach. So this is where we're going to take every file in the repo, we're going to change the file extension from JS to TS, and then we're going to see thousands of TypeScript errors, and we're just going to fix them all, right? As you can imagine, this has some pros and cons. So a pro being, it gets it all over with. You're done. You don't have to think about it anymore. You get all the benefits from TypeScript immediately after you're done. But there are some downsides. It's hard to do other things concurrently. Like either you have to tell people, hey, stop doing the other work you're doing while I convert everything to TypeScript, or you have to continually merge in the changes that other people are making, which is a big pain. And it can be tempting to disable strict settings. So TypeScript has a number of stricter options that you can enable, and I suggest that anybody who's using TypeScript do so. But if you're faced with the possibility of 3,000 errors if you use the strictest settings and 1,000 errors if you use the least strict, then those 1,000 errors start to look pretty tempting. But the problem is there's no real path to getting to the strict settings without fixing the other 2,000. So another approach you can look at is the gradual approach. And this is more like what I described earlier, where we're just converting a file at a time. And this also has some pros and cons. The one pro being you don't have to do it all at once. I think this is a really important property of any big migration that you're doing, is that you can do it bit by bit, and you don't have to stop all the work that anyone else is doing or continually merge things in and maintain your work. But as we saw in my story earlier, it takes a long time, especially if you're having trouble prioritizing that work over other work. And also, a file can still be a lot of work to convert by itself. Sometimes files can be thousands of lines long. We had some cases like that too. And so it can be very hard to say, oh, I'm touching this file. I'm going to convert the entire thing to TypeScript. And so then we have the third approach, the automation approach. And this is what I'm going to focus on today with the tool ts-migrate. This is the fastest approach because it is basically all automated. It can address all errors, even with the strictest settings. But one downside is it does give you worse types. So you can imagine that if you have a human applying types by hand, you're probably going to get better types than if you have an automation script that does everything automatically. And so it is a downside, but I think it's a downside that is worth it considering the other upsides. And you can still improve things over time, and you don't have to improve the entire file at once. You can just improve a single annotation at a time. So it becomes quite easy to just say, oh, I'm touching this area, and up here there's this annotation that could be a bit better, so I'm going to change that too. So now we're going to talk about ts-migrate and how it works. What is ts-migrate? It's an open source project out of Airbnb. So basically, they had a bunch of JavaScript, and they decided they wanted everything to be TypeScript, so they came up with this project because it would have been just too much work and take too long to do everything by hand. It transforms source code using what you might have heard called code mods. So it parses each file, transforms the parse representation, and then spits it back out again, and it's plugin based so that each plugin can focus on a particular type of TypeScript error and just be responsible for certain things. And you can also write your own plugins. It's a little bit hard to run your own plugins at the moment, but that's something I'd like to improve going forward. So at this point, you might be thinking, hey, this sounds like magic. I'm just going to run my code through this magical tool, and it's going to transform everything and give it perfect annotations, and it's just going to be great. And if that's the expectation you're going in with, you're probably going to be pretty disappointed, because there's no magic, right? You should basically go in with the expectation that it's going to apply the any type wherever it possibly can, maybe do some TS ignores, and if you go in with those really low expectations, you might be pleasantly surprised by a few things that it is able to do. And there's also this convention that you can apply to your code where you declare this alias called ts-fixme, and it acts exactly the same as any. But the reason we might want to use this, you could be thinking, oh, this looks really ugly. Why would I want this in my code? Well, that's kind of the point. So you set up this alias for any, and then ts-migrate is going to use this alias anytime it has to use the any type. So you know this is something I should fix later. It's basically like a to-do in the code. And I'm going to go through a few of the plugins and kind of what they do to your source code. So the first one is declare missing class properties. So here we've got a square class, and it has an area method, and that method is referencing a W property and an H property, which presumably are the width and the height of the square. And if you run this through TypeScript, TypeScript is going to complain, hey, you're referencing this W property that doesn't exist anywhere, and same thing with the H. So the declare missing class properties plugin is going to come in here, and it's going to add declarations for any property that is used within the class, and it doesn't know what type the property has, so it just uses ts-fix-me. You could imagine if it were a little bit smarter, maybe it could figure out that these are numbers, but this is as smart as it is at the moment. Another important one is add conversions. So here we've got a variable where we're setting it to an empty object, and then later on we want to set the A property of that object, and TypeScript says, hey, property A doesn't exist on empty object. So ts-migrate will add a conversion here to ts-fix-me again, and hopefully at some point later you can come and fix this so that the conversion is not needed anymore. Explicit any, so a parameter to a function that doesn't have an annotation implicitly has the any type in TypeScript, and if you have the strictest settings, the TypeScript compiler doesn't allow that. It complains that you must have an annotation on this parameter. So that's what's happening here, because we don't have an annotation on X. And explicit any is going to basically do what the name says and explicitly add an any type here. ts-fix-me. Again, we should come back and fix that later, but it'll get rid of the error for now. Before I introduce this next plugin, I want to talk quickly about ts-ignore. So this is a comment that you can put in a TypeScript file, and it will cause the compiler to ignore any errors that are on the next line of the file. And then there's another type of comment that is ts-expect error, which is a little bit different from ts-ignore. This says to the compiler, expect there to be a type error on the next line of the file. And so if there is actually not a type error on the next line of the file, then this comment will become an error. And that's quite useful because you know that you never have useless ignore comments in a file. And so this next plugin is basically the last thing that runs in ts-migrate. It's kind of the nuclear option where if there's some other error that TypeScript complains about and ts-migrate doesn't know how to fix it in any other way, it's just going to add a ts-expect error comment. So here we've got a silly hello function that takes a name parameter, and if the name parameter is truthy, it will say hello name and otherwise hello world. So the compiler complains because we're calling hello with no parameters, and this parameter is not marked as optional by TypeScript. So TypeScript says, hey, we expect one argument here. So ideally, the fix is probably to add a question mark to make that parameter optional, but ts-migrate can't say that for sure, so instead it adds this ts-expect error, which we can probably easily fix later by just going and adding a question mark. And finally, once all the code mods have been applied, it runs through ESLint and auto-fixes all the things it can. This is really useful to try to preserve the style in your code, and I'll talk a bit more soon about how you can configure to preserve your style better, hopefully. And there are some other plugins. There's a JS doc one. If you have lots of JS doc annotations, those can be converted to TypeScript. Member accessibility, so it can make your properties and methods private, protected, or public based on naming conventions. There are a bunch of React plugins because Airbnb uses React. It would be nice to see other frameworks on here eventually, but this is what there is for now. Okay, so let's talk about the preparation steps that you can take. And most of the things I'm going to talk about are optional, so you don't have to do them, but you'll probably get better results if you do them. Although the first one I'm going to talk about is actually not optional, and that is prepare your build system. So there are as many JavaScript build system setups as there are stars in the sky, so I can't possibly tell you how to set up your build system. But if you're using Webpack, there's a loader for that. If you're using Rollup, there's a plugin. There's a Babel preset. There's probably something for whatever it is that you're using. And I don't know, just go do some Googling, I guess, to try to find the best way. ES modules, I would suggest that you use ES modules if your currently on CommonJS, so if you're using require or module.export, it's probably about time to switch over to ES modules because that's the direction that everything's going. TypeScript will work with CommonJS, but it won't work as well in my experience. So I suggest making this change. Install types packages. So TypeScript relies on type declarations to be present for your dependencies, so it can know what types your dependencies use, but not every dependency comes with type declarations. So sometimes you need to install these third-party type packages, which are usually under the types scope in NPM. And it would be really nice if ts-migrate would do this automatically as part of the migration, but it's not quite there yet. So for now, you have to look through your dependencies and figure it out yourself. ESLint. So probably a lot of you are using ESLint already. And to prepare for TypeScript, you will want to switch to the TypeScript ESLint parser, so it understands TypeScript syntax. I'd also suggest looking at the ESLint plugin prettier, so it will run prettier over your code. This will make it so that the ESLint fix plugin will basically run prettier over all the files that it touches, and so that will keep the changes to a minimum if you were using prettier already. Of course, if you're not using prettier already, this may be a bit of a larger decision to make, but you can think about that. And so now we're going to look at a live demo. And before I get into this too far, I do want to call out a few places in which I'm cheating. So first, I'm using an unmerged branch of ts-migrate to better preserve blank lines. The currently published version of ts-migrate has a problem where it will remove all blank lines in your code, which made some people unhappy, and I've got a pull request in to fix that, but it hasn't been merged quite yet. So I'm being honest about it at least. Also, dependencies are already installed because I didn't want to risk having Wi-Fi issues while I was up here, and I didn't want you to have to sit here while I install NPM packages. So aside from that, this is all real. Yes, cross your fingers. All right, how's my font size? Can you read that okay, or a bit bigger? Is that good? Okay, so the library that I'm looking at here is called React Date Picker. I admit, maybe one more way I cheated is I slightly cherry-picked this example. So it's one of, I did look through the most popular React component libraries. I chose React because I wanted to showcase some of the React plugins that ts-migrate has and what they can do. I also wanted something that already used prettier so that I wasn't completely mangling the formatting of the code. But I don't think I had to try too hard to find a project that was like that. So the first thing that we're going to do here is we're going to update the ESLint configuration. So we need to add the prettier plugin. So I've installed that dependency already, but I haven't actually configured it. We need to change the parser here to the TypeScript ESLint parser. And we're also going to enable the prettier rule so that that gets applied. Actually, I'm going to save without formatting so I don't change everything. And I'm also going to update the Babel configuration. Now this is a little bit interesting. This project actually used Flow in one file already, Flow being an alternative to TypeScript. And it actually just works, although it's not guaranteed to just work in every case. It happens to just work in this case because the syntax is quite similar. So we're going to go ahead and commit that. And the next step we're going to go through is, let's see. Oh, right, I need to add the type aliases. So I'm going to set up the tsfixme alias. ts-migrate does not add that for you automatically. So ts-fixme any, and there's another one I didn't talk about, which is ts-fixme function, which is for something that we know is a function, but we don't know anything else about it, so it could take any number of arguments. They could be of any type, might return anything. And then we'll go ahead and commit that. I do suggest committing often because you might always want to roll back to an earlier version. And now we can actually start the migration. So the first step is going to be to run ts-migrate, and there's an init command. And all that's going to do is it's going to create a tsconfig.json file with some defaults, and oops, I didn't want to print. We will mostly use those defaults with a few exceptions. So we're going to enable JSX React because this is a React project. I'm going to go ahead and set no emit to true, so we're not actually emitting JavaScript, just for the demo. And the last thing I'm going to do is I'm only going to include the source directory and not the tests, because honestly, I see most of the value in migrating the source and a bit less value in migrating the tests. Maybe we could come back another time and migrate the tests later. And you can use ts-migrate on projects that are partially TypeScript already, so that's totally fine, that works. So I'll go ahead and commit that. Oh, add that. Commit it. And then I'm going to run the next step, which is to rename, ts-migrate rename, which is going to rename all my JS files to TS and JSX to TSX. So I should see TSX files, and the JSX ones are deleted. And if I add the source directory, they're all just renames, so nothing else is changing. All right, so now if we run the TypeScript compiler, we should see a whole bunch of errors. Right, so almost 1,400 errors. Now we're going to run the migrate command, and I'm going to pass the aliases ts-fixme flag, and that's what tells ts-migrate to use the ts-fixme alias. Otherwise, it will just use any, and so you won't be able to distinguish between things which should actually be any and things that are just temporarily any. So I do suggest that you use this flag. Sorry, I should have hit enter before I talked because this will take about 30 seconds. Yeah, it's just printing out the names of the plugins it's running and how long they're taking. Explicit any, add conversions. It actually goes through 2 rounds of ESLint fixing because it can mess up the formatting when it runs the tsignore plugin. Right, so we've changed a whole bunch of files, and if we run the TypeScript compiler, we should get no errors. No errors. So what did we actually change? We can come in and look at some of these files to look at the diff. So this is a React component. One of the plugins fired here, the prop types plugin, it removed the prop types import, and instead it added the prop types as TypeScript types. So we have all the props here. It didn't know what the state of the calendar was. That's okay. It understands React components, so it can add the proper type for the props in the state. It's removed the original prop types here. You can actually configure it so it keeps the original prop types if you want. added the annotations to the lifecycle methods because it has a plugin that understands the lifecycle methods and what types they should have. Here we've had to add some ts-expect errors. Right, so that should give you a rough idea. If we look through the whole thing, we've actually got 116 ts-expect errors, which might sound like a lot, but we can fix some of those in fairly big groups. So I'll go ahead and commit and show you fixing one of those errors, just to give you an idea. So if we look in, I think the date utils file has some good examples. Yeah, here. So here we're calling this isValid function with one parameter. And if we go and look at the definition, this function takes 2 parameters. And then if we look at what the code is actually doing, we can see, oh, the second min date parameter is probably supposed to be optional. So it's exactly the case that I showed you earlier in the slide, basically. So we could go ahead and add a question mark here. And now we will have some type errors because those ts-expect error lines are no longer useful. We've found 6 unnecessary ts-expect error lines. And ts-migrate actually has a command that will let you take care of lots of these at once. So it has a re-ignore command, which will strip off all of the ts-expect error comments and then only add back the ones that are necessary. So if we run TypeScript compiler, should have no complaints. And if we look at what's changed in the diff, we've removed some error lines. Go ahead and add that, commit it. So we've just fixed 6 errors. And you can kind of just work your way through it. I mean, if we wanted to, after that initial migrate, we could reasonably, I think, make a pull request and call it good for the day and come back to it later and fix the rest later. And so that should basically give you an idea of the workflow. I would suggest prioritizing getting rid of all the ts-expect error comments at least, because those are a little bit dangerous because any error in that line will end up getting ignored. And then the ts-fixmes you can just work through as you touch things. Right, so these were the commands that I ran, not including the reignore command. I don't know if these slides will get shared somewhere afterwards, so you can write these down. And so just to give you an idea of where things are headed, these are kind of the roadmap items, priority items as I see them. So the first thing that I'd like to do is add the type packages installation automatically, so you don't have to do that beforehand. Have some sort of configuration file format so that you can write your own custom plugins and configure how they're used. Better documentation, because the documentation right now is not that good. And then further down the road, it would be nice to try some sort of type inference plugin. I've played with this a little bit, and I think there's some promise here. And then finally, more framework or library-specific plugins, for other frameworks, common libraries. That's something I'd really like to see. And if any of these things sound interesting to you and you think you might like to work on them, get in touch. I would be more than happy to mentor anybody in contributing to the code base, point you in the right direction. And that's it.